Thank you, David and Esther, for that really thought-provoking conversation. We're now going to move into a discussion around the global food crisis, how it is connected to the climate change, and what solutions, critically, might be available to address this. So just in terms of housekeeping, I think you're getting into the rhythm now. I want to remind you all that we will have a Q&A session at the end, so everyone feel free to prepare some challenging questions from our panelists, whether you are here in person or indeed whether you are joining us virtually online. So to moderate this discussion, we are delighted to have Emily Weinstein, the food and cooking editor for The Times, here with us today. But before Emily comes on stage with her panelists, I want to thank the Boston Consulting Group for their support for the Climate Forward series and welcome Shalini Unikrishnan, who is the global lead for societal impact at BCG, at the BCG Group. So please, give her a very warm welcome before the session. Thank you. Shalini.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this next discussion, No Food, No Future. We made tremendous progress in productivity in agriculture over several decades, but yet what we have is a fragile food system. A food system that produces enough food, but about a third of it goes away, lost or wasted. A food system where the number of people that will go hungry has risen to 830 million. A food system that is not resilient to shocks. Climate events, now Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have put immense pressure. The FAO's food price index went up 23% in 1 year, and this is affecting the entire world. In the past, when we've come remotely close to this, there have been mass migrations, conflicts, displacements, and a lot more is to come in the next decades as population increases and the number of extreme events escalates. The number of people that are going to be affected is estimated to be 3.5 billion. Yields could fall 10–25% with each degree rise in temperature. What we need, of course, is urgent resources to address the humanitarian crisis, but we also need a holistic food systems transformation. We need a food system that is productive, but is also resilient. We need a food system that produces delicious, nutritious food, but within planetary boundaries. The good news is we know how to do this. The solutions are here. We need to scale regenerative agriculture. We need to scale alternative proteins. We need to grow different grains. There are many options out there. So I'm really excited, BCG is really excited to support these conversations. The next discussion promises to be very invigorating. We're excited to be working across systems as we drive this change, and thank you for coming today.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning here at the Times Center. I'm Emily Weinstein. I'm the food and cooking editor here at the New York Times. And we are here to discuss an issue at the top of the international agenda, the global food crisis. From essentials like wheat and maize to products like Dijon mustard, we're witnessing food shortages across the globe. And much of the current crisis is being driven by war and other conflict. And that war in Ukraine, of course, caused a jump in the price of food and fertilizer. But the reality is that the food system was already broken, and that is well before Russia invaded Ukraine. As my colleague Samini Sengupta, who we've already seen today, has written, hunger is a problem of plenty, not scarcity in modern times. We produce more food than we eat, and yet millions of people go hungry because they cannot afford it. And it's true, we've seen a huge expansion of food production. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the production of primary crops, so that's mainly sugarcane, maize, wheat, and rice, expanded by 52% between the years 2000 and 2020, reaching a record 9.3 billion metric tons in 2019. Yet rising food prices are leading to famine. In 2021, nearly 193 million people were food insecure. 193 million, and that's 40 million more than in 2020. The situation is particularly acute in the Horn of Africa, where 18 million people are facing severe hunger following a 4-year drought. A changing climate, of course, is wreaking further havoc, making a horrible problem even worse. It's driving down yields, interrupting supply chains, and impacting the predictability of weather patterns for farmers. So now, these are mind-blowing problems. These are horrible numbers, and they're representative of real human suffering. And so I want to have a conversation about the implications of this crisis and explore how it's playing out in different regions of the world and for different communities. I also, though, want to have a conversation that looks towards solutions. What are the opportunities for tackling the crisis in which we find ourselves, both at the very local level of the smallholder farmer and at the international policy level? And so we have a great pair of speakers with us today to explore those questions. Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the president of AGRA, that's the alliance supporting smallholder farms in Africa, and Svein Holsether, the president and CEO of Yara, the Norwegian fertilizer giant. And I also want to bring all of your voices into the conversation, and so we'll be opening up to audience questions later in the discussion, so please prepare your questions. So Agnes and Svein, thank you so much again for joining us. Agnes, can you contextualize the scale of the current global food crisis, and also, help us understand how it differs from crises that came before?
So, thank you for having me, first of all. It's really great to be part of this conversation. I mean, you've put a lot of the stats out there, but let me just remind us all that when we signed the SDGs, the 2030 agenda that we are all committed to, we had 770 million people that were hungry, right? And we are working, when we signed up, we were working our way towards zero. That's why we have zero hunger. Today, we have 828 million people that are hungry. It's the first time ever that we have 40 million people being hungry over a period of 1 year. So that's the scale of things. But in terms of then what is different, probably two things are different. This is happening, this is not just about hunger and food per se. This is about everything that has been building on top of one thing on top of the other. COVID-19 happened, and the reason COVID-19 is important, it's not because of how many people became vulnerable, and yes, many people did become vulnerable. It's the depletion of resources that makes it very difficult for this particular moment to be managed. So if you're a country in Africa, 60% of countries in Africa today have such depletion of resources that they are having it difficult to cope with this situation. They have a debt to GDP ratio that is more than 50%, which means they can't afford basic services of dealing with the current crisis of food security. The second challenge is what is new, is that this is happening at a time of, it's not one crisis, it's the food crisis, it's the financial crisis, it's the climate crisis. So multiple things coming together. It's the first time that we have 1 in every 3 Africans living in a country that has the 3 crises happening at the same time. So that's what is new. The last part that is new, I'm not sure that this is going away. We usually have a crisis and you feel like, yeah, this crisis has an end by date, or it's this is something we can fix. The climate conversation or the climate dimension makes it difficult for me to say that this is something we can fix, because this is something that every year just keeps getting worse. So that's what is new.
Oh, Sven, can you remember a time when there were converging crises, certainly not at the scale, but like this? Or like Agnes, do you just feel this is completely exceptional?
No, I think this is completely exceptional, but unfortunately, I think it's going to be the new normal. And thanks for inviting us here and to put food on the agenda, because as Agnes also said, there's no near-term end to this. So the remedy here has to be to think differently around the whole food system, and also now put focus on what really matters, because climate is also part of this, and we see now with how that is impacting farmer livelihoods and farmer yields across the world, whether it's droughts in China, or look at satellite images of Europe in August this year compared to last year. It's brown versus green, and with floods in Pakistan, record temperatures in North America and in India destroying crops, and so and across Africa, and you see it in Brazil. So it's climate change is impacting the livelihoods of farmers and the predictability, and the system today isn't resilient to these climate changes. So we need to think differently about farming than we've done in the past, but there are solutions to this as well. Focusing on soil and soil health, so that it's both more nutritious but also able to withstand these changes. But it's a result of a food system where we really got what we paid for in the past, and that was producing maximum amount of calories, but not necessarily focusing on how healthy it was. Also not taking into account how politically unstable the food system is. Look, Russia's war on Ukraine is creating huge disruptions to both food production, but also to fertilizer and energy that it takes to produce fertilizers. We saw in COVID-19, when you have global value chains, when you have disruptions or bottlenecks in harbors, it restricts the flow of food. So it's a combination of all of this makes it exceptional. But I fully agree with Agnes. We can't just sit back now and this will just pass and we're back to normal again. We won't unless we take action.
The idea that this is the new normal is of course very, very troubling. But before we move on to solutions, though, I did want to ask you, you brought up droughts, flooding. I'm sure you've all seen the remarkable and horrible photos of the flooding in Pakistan, drought in China, droughts elsewhere, of course, Horn of Africa. What are sort of the more hidden impacts of climate change, in food production? What are the things we can't necessarily see in news photography? It's fine. Would you jump on?
I can. Well, we see the big disasters on TV, and they're tragic, and has a huge impact on productivity. What doesn't necessarily reach the headlines is the everyday smaller things and the unpredictability of weather that is causing difficulties for farmers. It's at a lower scale, but it is also impacting yields of farmers. And look at soil erosion. How much of land across the world is degraded now and doesn't have the right amount of nutrients, and where nutrients are washed away, or it becomes really impossible to grow food on it. These are smaller things. It happened gradually, but it adds up to be quite dramatic, but it doesn't get the headlines like the natural disasters that we see. But it's a new normal for farmers across the world.
And Agnes, is there anything you would add there?
Yeah. I think what is tragic, excuse me, what is tragic is that the people are suffering, and we are not sharing in their suffering, at least in the knowledge of that suffering. So for households that are finding it very difficult to feed their families with a nutritious meal, just because it's becoming so much more difficult to do that these days, we really don't know what they're going through. For businesses, and just imagine 43% of women businesses, for example, in the last 2 years alone, lost 50% of their capital. Some of that you might say is COVID, but a lot of it, if you're in the agriculture sector, is also related to climate change. The number of businesses that are looking to invest in Africa, and I'm saying Africa in this case because for the longest time, Africa has been experiencing all these challenges. I think they haven't been as visible to the rest of the world. But for the people that live on the equator, the challenge of increasing velocity of climate change was just there. And what I see as a disconnect is when we project that, we are going to lose 12% yield by 2050. African farmers are losing 50% to 100% yield every other season. So I think some of this that is not in the mainstream, some of this that is not captured, but is the realities that people live on the ground is important. The pest pressure that we see now, whether it's increases in malaria or increases in locusts in East Africa, these are things that we live with every day. And these are, of course, the hidden or the other side of climate change that is not food crisis, but it contributes to food crisis.
And Svein, so you've said before that solutions, which we started to get at, solutions don't have to be invented, they just have to be implemented. Just as, it'll, of course, just is a small word and with big implications, but just implemented. And there are many possible solutions. And so I would love for you both to jump in and share what you believe are some of the more promising solutions right now. So Agnes, can we start with you? What do you see as some of the more promising solutions?
So there are a number of things, but I start with the area that I work in. I work for Agra, and for the longest time we've been trying to help ensure that farmers can have access to improved seeds that increase yields. So the good news is today there are also drought-tolerant seeds. There are also flood-resistant seeds. So these are all varieties of crops that we grow in Africa that can actually survive in extremes of environment. So the new normal is going to have to be that crops we grow can survive in extremes of environment. So that's really important. That's an opportunity we can exploit and ensure that many more farmers have access to these varieties that can help them survive in extremes of environment. The other opportunities we need to be more comfortable growing and producing what we are competitively capable of producing. So, we do eat wheat. It's globally traded and all that, but we can also make bread from cassava. So diversifying food sources is another opportunity that we are not exploiting enough in Africa, and there are many, many more of those that we can exploit. And then, of course, doubling down on investing in the agriculture sector. This is an area that is so important to all of us, but at least from the African continent perspective, we probably haven't invested as much as we should invest. So if we do those three, ensure that farmers have access to what they need, ensure that they have access to markets, open up and really double down on the Africa intercontinental trade area, like the rest of the world has. US is what it is because of the market it puts on the table. We haven't optimized that in Africa, so we need to start working on those things.
And Svein, would you add anything there?
Yeah, and technology is key here, and when I said that it's just about the implementation, it sounds easy. It is a big task, but in terms of seeds, nutrition, understanding the conditions in the soil, you can use satellite imaging now to see the nutrient deficiencies in the fields of the farmers. You have weather services that can give hyper-local weather that can help the farmers to make the right decisions. So the information that in the past would only be available to large industrial scale farmers can now, through either smartphones or regular phones, be made available to smallholder farmers as well. But it's about getting that competence out there and the knowledge, and that's where we need support and also funding to get that done. And we need to have leaders like Agnes that are out there every day to drive this message to both to the farming communities, but also to to governments and regulators. Another thing that we need is it's a call out also for philanthropists and development agencies to help to fund Agra and what Agnes is doing. Do we want her to spend all her time or a lot of her time getting funding or being out there to drive this forward? So it needs to get this clear voice out there, and then the solutions are already there. With no need for miracles or new innovations. Let's use what we have, and then it's about the practice of regenerative agriculture. That it ticks so many boxes because it's helping to create a better soil. A better soil gives better nutrition for the plants. It's more resilient if you have a flood or a drought, and it reduces the emissions as well. So it's about getting those messages out there.
Maybe I would be amiss if I didn't talk about food systems and what the role they play. Sorry, because last year we had the Food Systems Summit, which you all participated in. But I think the opportunity the Food Systems Summit and conversation brings on the table is just the fact that there are so many solutions now, but also the fact that producing food cannot be done at the cost of two things that are very critical: the environment and people's health. So we need to produce better diets, and that is again within our control. We can do it from a food system and food production perspective, but also we need to be very conscious of our environment and the fact that it's under too much pressure. From food, by the way, a lot of it we don't eat. Right? $1 trillion of what we produce is not even consumed, it's wasted. So I think those are the two dimensions that we cannot forget even as we think about solutions.
Could you speak a little bit more about that tension between food production but being mindful also about climate impact in improving that food production?
Yeah, so that is really the reason why we had the Food Systems Summit. Like you started out saying, we produce more food than we need. We produce 1.5 times much more food than we need. But thousands of tons of that food is wasted, right? So there's an opportunity to be very deliberate around how we produce food. We've become very good at designing very good logistics and distribution networks that really has become the anchor of food security in the world. But that's been recently has been put to question with COVID-19 disrupting supply chains, with now this crisis disrupting supply chains further. Does that mean that we stop depending on each other for food? No, but it also provides an opportunity for us to think about even shorter supply chains that can be more environmental sensitive, but also can be more resilient, can provide more resilience to the types of shocks and stresses we have. So I think the opportunity there is really finding the balance and ensuring that it's not about trade-offs and it's not about what we need to stop doing, but rather it's about knowing that we have to create the right balance for the environment, and that involves regenerative agriculture. These are practices as Africans have used since time memorial, but we abandoned because of some of the more easier mainstream type of businesses that have come to be associated with the agriculture sector. Now we need to step back and understand the value they bring to our soil, and understand the contribution they bring to biodiversity, and understand that the complexity of all those things are needed for a good soil, for a healthy environment, and a healthy environment is important for healthy crops and healthy people. So that's what the food system put on the table. And going forward with clarity of the need to balance how we live with the environment is going to have to be what takes us to the future. We can't produce food at any cost. We can't keep lowering the cost of food at any cost, because that's what we've been doing, pushing down the cost of food at any cost. But let's remember that the real true cost is the environment. The real true cost is when we don't eat right, and it shows up in our nutrition and diet-related diseases.
And if I could add, this is all connected, and 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. So it's part of the problem, but it also has to be part of and can be a part of the solution. And I can't really think of any occupation more impacted by climate change than being a farmer. and that needs to be addressed, and that starts from the input side with fertilizer production that we're doing. I heard Al Gore talk about natural gas here before. There is a different way to produce fertilizers than using natural gas. You can do it with renewable energy to produce green hydrogen, green ammonia. We're working on that. It's about regenerative ag practices, but it's about helping the farmers, putting incentives in place for the farmers. And I was quite encouraged. I spent this week in upstate New York where I met with several farmers from the US, and to see now what is happening in farming in the US with the government now putting incentives in place to bridge the gap towards regenerative farming, so that we're working with the farmers, not putting additional burdens on their shoulders. And then we have to work through the whole value chain. That's the only way to get this done, so that we connect farmers with the consumers, so the US consumers can direct your spending towards farmers that drive sustainable practices. And if you do that, and I'm working very closely with Paul Polman in the Food Collective, is the former Unilever CEO now, working on creating these tipping points for industries where standards can be changed for a whole industry by bringing the whole value chain together. But there are things happening, there are encouraging developments. Is it accelerating fast enough? No, not fast enough now.
Well, this is a good moment, I think, to turn it over to the audience for questions. Okay, it's right here.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I'm Katie Poozer, and I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer. In 2006, I was in West Africa, and I'm wondering how cotton subsidies impact the food system.
How?
Cotton subsidies impact the food system.
That's an interesting question.
Anyone?
But
It's fine.
To go into detail on cotton subsidies in West Africa, it's challenging. But what I can say with subsidies, if you look at subsidies across the whole food system, there are billions and billions of dollars going into subsidies that drive the wrong practices. Now, I don't know the exact example of cotton, but if you could say rethink how subsidies are distributed so that it incentivizes the right farming techniques, and where farmers get rewarded for good soil practices and focusing on climate, it could make a huge difference. It requires quite a bit of money to get to regenerative farming and climate-friendly farming, but not necessarily more than what is being subsidized to drive the wrong practices. Today we see so much wrong nutrient that is being used out there. So it's an interesting topic, but maybe we could do that offline to go into the specifics, so I know exactly what you're alluding to.
Right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Whitney Bauk. I am an independent climate and environment reporter, and I just wrote a story for the first time about edible insects and learned that crickets, for example, can produce the same amount of protein as beef for 0.1% of the emissions. I'd love to hear any of you talk about what role you think insect agriculture might have in addressing both food security and the climate crisis.
I can take that. First, because I'm an entomologist. I went to school here actually in the US studying entomology, so yeah. Yeah, and I used to tell people that I study insect entomology, and they're like, what? I'm like, bugs. Do you know about bugs? so yeah. But insects are a great source of protein, and they are great also because they have a very short lifespan, so the turnover is very fast. In fact, today, interestingly, in Rwanda, we have there's a company that is trying to grow the black soldier fly from waste coming from the city. So this waste is put in one place, and it is fed to the black soldier fly, and the black soldier fly is then converted into your equivalent of soy protein for animal feed. So animal feed is going to be, so you kill several birds with the same stone. You remove the waste from the city, you feed it on insects, and then you use the insects to produce the protein. So then you remove the need for soybean, which takes so much from the environment, and that will become a food. So that's one thing. That type of food I can deal with, eating eggs that have been fed on soja fly, that has been fed on municipal waste. I can deal with that. But there's another type of food which is very common in many African cultures. We do eat insects. There are certain types of termites that are eaten. There are certain types of crickets that are eaten. And all of them, I mean, I don't know how many of you eat shrimps here. If you told an African to eat a shrimp, they would probably freak out. But they wouldn't probably freak out on the part of the insect because these are cultures that people grow up in. So there's an opportunity also to look at some of those, what they call indigenous dishes, and grow them for purposes of ensuring that those communities that do have these as indigenous dishes can actually have them as mainstream of what they do. And again, others that don't have cultural boundaries on this, that don't have cultural challenges, can also start looking at what is possible. For example, the grasshopper in Uganda is a delicacy, right? If a husband will basically fire you. Do they fire wives? Will basically divorce you if there's no grasshopper over Christmas, right? So that type of thing. But it's all the culture around insects is, I mean, turning insect into food is an opportunity, but we have to start with the cultural perspectives of it, ensure that where it's being done, it can be done well, and then we'll see if other people can adopt it through opportunities, like I just said, the factory that is producing black soja fly.
Thank you for that great question. Before we move on to the next question, I would love to know who in the audience has eaten insects. It's less common in the United States, but obviously a delicacy in many parts of the world. Okay, quite a few. Yeah, I have as well.
Yeah.
Anyone? What do you think of insects for the American palate? It is good. Yes.
I mean, if you eat shrimps, you should eat.
Yeah, I think they're quite delicious when cooked. Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next question. Yeah. There's one all the way in the back up there.
Hi, I'm Adele Jones from the Sustainable Food Trust. My question is for Swine, and thank you for the conversation today, really interesting. We work with farmers to help them transition to genuinely regenerative agriculture, and those farmers who are, I suppose you could say, ahead of the curve are either entirely biological in nature, i.e. they use no external inputs, or they're reducing their use of external inputs a lot so they can increase efficiencies, increase their net profits, rebuild soil fertility through rotations, through cover cropping. And I'm just wondering how that squares with a company like Yara. If you know, the Stockholm Resilience Centre work shows that nitrogen phosphorus use is exceeding planetary boundaries hugely, what's the future for companies like Yara?
Well, I believe we have a very important role to play. It's a different one than historically, and I have to say that the industry traditionally has been too focused on volumes, tons of nutrients, rather than how those nutrients work in the soil. And at the same time, we also have to recognize that half of the food in the world today is produced because of mineral fertilizers. So it's a combination where, you know, in regenerative farming, part of it could be purely organic, where you're replacing the nutrients in the soil with residues or with cover crops and so on, but it wouldn't be enough to feed the world. But by focusing on regenerative ag practices and understanding how the soil works and having good soil health, the ability of the soil to absorb the nutrients is much higher. And when you get that right, you can increase the nutrient use efficiently significantly. And we're seeing that we can probably reduce 50-60% of the consumption by getting these practices in place. And it's about balanced nutrition as well. Plants are just like us humans. If they don't get the right mix of nutrients, they will not grow and be as healthy as they should be. So it's about understanding and replacing the nutrients. And I saw that clearly with the farmers that have come the furthest on this, that yes, you will reduce fertilizer consumption. That has to be part of the solution, and that's how we're changing our strategy and how we're working as well. So I'm spending actually quite a bit of my time working on reducing fertilizer consumption rather than increasing it, because I believe that the future will be solutions where we sell technology and services in combination with a product, but it's not only a product that we try to maximize for the next quarter. We've been around for 117 years as a company, and we will be around for another 100 years as well, but we won't be able to do that unless we also look at what's best for the farmer and what's best for the environment.
Maybe we get the same question all the time, but not from a Yara perspective, because you're a company, but from a perspective of balancing environmental sustainability and fertilizer use. And I would say that from an African perspective, we really need to appreciate that we have not been using fertilizers enough. And because of that, we end up using more environment. I can tell you that every time we think about food production, we have farmers that every time their small piece of land fails, they do more land. They cut more trees so that they can get more land. So we need to find a balance that allows us as Africans to use more nutrients from the soil, to use more nutrients to get the crop we need without killing the environment, right? Killing the environment comes in two ways. It could come by overuse of fertilizers, which we don't do, or it could come by cutting down the environment to be able to get what you need. So what we are trying to do is to find the right balance. Where do we up our nutrient use from the current near zero levels, but not to the 300 levels that we also see in Europe or in the US, but really get to a place where instead of producing 10 metric tons, for example, of maize, we move from the 1 metric ton or half to 5 metric tons, which is good economics for anybody who is doing that business, good economics for food, and good economics for the environment. So finding that balance is extremely important, because otherwise we'd have to continue depending on the environment, which is not where we want to be. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more over here.
Hi, I'm Allie Forsman from Recultivate New York, and we're talking about food waste and we're talking about soil health, and those two in my world collide on a daily basis. So I'd like to know a little bit about composting and how you feel about that, because it not only helps restore soil and use a lot of this food waste, but it also mitigates things like soil erosion and chemical contamination.
So I can talk about composting from a Rwanda perspective, because I lived through it. Rwanda is, if you've been there or if you haven't, it's a very hilly country. And because of that, we lose a whole lot of soil. We also do terracing so that we can stabilize soil. Every time you terrace, you're disturbing the topsoil. So we need to reconstitute the topsoil. We do a lot of composting in terms of so that we can reconstitute the topsoil. We basically bring in vegetation, decompose it, and then put it on top the top layer to rebuild that soil. One of the things I've learned is that there's no faster way of destroying biodiversity than trying to do composting, unless it's coming from two places: city waste and home waste. But if you're going to depend on vegetation to do composting, it's really a very fast way of degrading the environment. So again, we can depend on a few other things, home waste and city waste, and try to get that back into the environment, and even farm waste. So I'm all for those. But every time you want to say, if we want to rebuild our soils and get food based on composting, as long as we stay away from live vegetation as a form of introducing composite. Because here we are dealing with two things, rebuilding soil, but also maintaining biodiversity. And every piece of vegetation you cut is reducing biodiversity. Is food for insects, is food for something else. So for me, that's the complexity that I see. But the opportunity, of course, is we have so much city waste that is not being used. We have so much human waste that is not being used. So those type of composting can be used and in a constructive way without damaging what's already going on. But you probably have a different view.
No, I think now with the price levels that we're seeing on both fertilizer and also affordability of food, every nutrient counts. So this could actually be the moment where we fundamentally change farming. Look at what happened in the 1970s with the oil crisis and what happened to the car industry, how many miles per gallon you had before and after. It doubled just in a matter of a few years because it was expensive. And now we're in the same situation and for the food system as well. So if we can use this now to accelerate forward and really think of nutrients as precious so that we utilize them to the full extent, and the opportunity is there to do the same thing, to double the efficiency. It's possible.
All right, and we're at time end, but thank you so much. Thank you, Svein. Thank you, Agnes, for joining us today.